Jesi milostivi čovekoljubiv Bog i tebi slavu uznosimo, Otcu i Sinu i Svetome Duhu, sada i u vekove vekova.
In a world of shadows and secrets untold, where primeval stories make the brave go cold, mighty gods are high and realms below, whispers of legends that shape each soul. And nightmarish dreams, cryptids lurking, nothing's as it seems, giants walking, angels and demons fight, only truth can bring the light. Through the echoes of time, the tales unfold, mysteries arise as the prophecies are foretold, from valiant knights to buried treasure, this podcast brings nothing but pleasure. Welcome to myth, mysteries and majesty. Study with us, and don't be a travesty. Theology, mythology, fantasy, and horror. Dungeons and dragons to Skyrim and Mordor. And Mordor, powers haunt the evening, in gothic castles where they're screaming. Wizards cast spells in their towers tonight, exploiting enigmas hidden from our sight. Archaeologists make excavations deep of the ancient tombs where pharaohs sleep. In the dust of ages we chronicles keep, storytelling's power of monsters that creep. Mysteries and majesty is the place for you to learn about this haunted space. From scholarship to manuscripts of old, unlock the secrets of wisdom and gold.
Blessed Sunday, everyone. Welcome to episode 152 with my special VIP guest, Dr. Mark Chavalas. Tonight, we'll be talking about a very interesting combo where we'll be comparing and dissecting the material coming from the Old Testament, especially, from the Bible, especially Old Testament, with some of the Mesopotamian myths and stories. So here we'll be talking about giants, with, of course, cross-referencing some passages, especially when it comes to Genesis 6. We'll be talking about King Og as one of those most famous giants. We'll be talking about sages, about the Apkallu, Anunnaki, gods, and all these interesting things. So if you're into theology, if you're into mythology, if you're into learning more things, please grab books, please grab notes, please grab your pens, because we'll be talking about some very cool things tonight, and we'll be cross-referencing and giving some of the scholarly sources. So hopefully you'll get some of those things for tonight, some of those books for yourself, including I have provided the Amazon page to Dr. Chavalas's Amazon books, so you can treat yourself, your pastor, your family members, your friends with some of those finest books. Dr. Chavalas, thank you so much for finding time for the audience and for myself. Welcome on the channel. And if we can please start by you introducing yourself, something about yourself, spiritually, theologically, books you wrote, church you attend, stuff like that.
Well, thank you. It really is a pleasure, Nicola, to be on, and it's always a lot of fun to do things like this, and so I'm looking forward to it. A little bit about my background. I'm a Californian through and through. In fact, I joke that I'm a Greco-Californian, but that hasn't made it on the roster yet. But my grandfather made it from old country, from Athens, I think about 1908, if I can check the records. And so the Chavalas clan has been here. Unfortunately, when they got off at Ellis Island, there was about 5 different spellings of the name. And so it's hard for us to get together. So we have a TS, a CH, an SH, an S. That's a famous actor, Telly Savalas, and then a TZ. And so all sorts of ones. My strand is all over the country now, but I won't give you a year-to-year rendering of all of this. I'll go a little quick. So basically, I'm raised in Southern California, but very much of a Southern California boy. I still bleed Dodger blue. And so if I talk to anybody about baseball, that'll come up. So anyway, as a kid, I was convinced I was actually going to play for the Dodgers. I got this close. The only thing that stopped me was talent. I had everything else but talent. And so what I'm saying is I didn't get close at all. So as a kid, I liked baseball. I loved reading. And by my early teens, I found out I really got hooked on history, things like the Mongols and other stuff. And then, of course, occurred to me as I got older, oh, they actually did this stuff. It's not a fairy tale. This isn't nearly as fun to read about slaughtering and all that. And raised in a good Christian environment, solid Presbyterian. And so I got a very solid dose of scripture from an early age from my mom. My dad was a good guy. He became a believer later on in life, but so I had a good solid background. We went to other churches as I got older that were really Bible based. And so I really had that understanding that studying the Bible was like studying your chemistry book. Well, not chemistry for me, but like any other book, is that you study it really, really hard. It's an important job to study it, just like you study anything else. So when I went to college, of course, I became a math major instead, because that seemed practical. By the way, I went to a school called San Fernando Valley State College, which later became Cal State Northridge, or as we affectionately called it, Cal State Nowhere. But in any event, I was a math major for about 2 years, and I was really, really good with numbers. I could add and subtract and divide and multiply in my head, anything you wanted. But when those numbers became Greek letters and curly Q's and all this other stuff, even though I had a Greek background, it was a disaster. So I couldn't pass calculus or anything else. But I really worked hard at it and failed every exam. And it occurred to me, the light bulb hit, maybe I'm not a math person in terms of it going further. Well, I've got this fun hobby. It's reading history books all the time. And so I switched over to history and kept on gravitating towards the early stuff. And I'm thinking at this point, because really I was 17 when I started college, and 17 and a half or whatever it was. And in my immaturity, part of it was, hey, I'm studying this really, really old stuff, pre-Greek and Roman. It's like, yeah, everybody knows about the Greeks and the Romans, but I want to study those Babylonian guys because nobody knows anything about it. So I thought it would make me cool. Well, it didn't make me cool. It's like, it was a conversation killer. It still is, by the way. Can you imagine coming up to somebody and says, so what do you do? I read dead languages. Well, they usually will hightail it. Oh, excuse me, I have to go somewhere. I don't know where, but I have to go somewhere.
I know the feeling, by the way, even though I don't read dead languages, but if, the topics I love to talk with my Christian church friends, they don't like those. So I'm like, okay, I won't talk about those topics. But then I notice, like, if you do, things can get weird. Like, if they cannot participate or they don't care, the atmosphere changes. So then I'll be like, okay, maybe this is more for my internet friends and scholars, so I can develop, this
well, and so I've been spending really, and if you think about it, about 50 years trying to figure out how to do this in a way that will cause people to be drawn towards it. Oh, I didn't know that. How do you know that? Oh, especially now in the last 30 years, because of access to the internet, people can find just about anything. And unfortunately, that's another problem. They can find just about anything. And so, here I am trying to be rather sober about this. But in any event, so I love studying the Bible. I love studying ancient history. So I got a degree at Cal State Northridge, and I was working in the grocery business, just moving on here. I'm in my early 20s, and I asked my professor who did ancient history, hey, this is really, really great stuff. I would like to go further with it. he says, well, you can't do that here. I said, well, why not? Well, we don't have a graduate program in Babylonian stuff or ancient stuff. I said, well, where's the closest place? I'm sort of tied around. He says, well, it's UCLA. I didn't know anything about anything. And I didn't even know that, as a Christian, maybe it would have been good to go to Bible college or seminary. It just never crossed my mind. But I'm looking back on it now, and God must have had other plans, because if I would have done that, then I couldn't possibly have taught in a secular context like I did for the last 40 years. And so in any event, so I went to UCLA. Somehow I got in, and the professor, they gave me to the Greek professor to be interviewed. And first thing he told me was, well, I would encourage you not to come into the program. And I said, well, why not? Well, you'll never get a job out of it. And after he was finished, after 20 minutes, he was very powerful, theatrical, impressive person. I said, well, can I come in anyway? I've already got a great job. This is just fun. And he said, well, okay. But you never talk about, all you talk about is Babylonian stuff. You need to go over to Giorgio Bucciolati. I said, well, some Italian guy, fine. I don't. And at the time, Bucciolati, who's now in his late 80s, but he was 39 at the time. So this was a while back. And yeah, it literally would have been 50 years ago. And I came in and he says, well, if you come into this program, you will be studying the ancient languages in their original form, studying the cuneiform text. We are going on a dig next year. You're coming with us. Oh, and you can do some history. And now you point your thumb up. I didn't even like sandbox as a kid. So my first thought was, I don't want to go in the overseas. They were going to Syria. And I'm like, no, that doesn't sound appealing to me. And I have to tell you, I'm a historian who has masqueraded 9 seasons as an archaeologist. And so it was invaluable. And I was actually a little perturbed about having to learn the ancient languages, because I just want to learn what happened. Let other people have to, struggle through all that other stuff. And I'm definitely not gifted with the languages. It never came easy for me, even though I ended up teaching Babylonian, or the technical name is Akkadian. It was never an automatic, and I came to love it. It came to be a really, really fun thing to do. So I did that. And then as I matured in my faith, I understood that, this is actually really helpful to understand the Bible. If you start reading the Old Testament, and of course you probably had this experience, but over and over again, people come up, the Old Testament is really, really strange. I don't understand it very well. And I said, yeah, me neither. They said, well, what do you mean? Well, no, it's really hard. And I think part of it is because it was not written to our environment. It was written to another environment. In fact, it was my colleague, John Walton, who taught at Moody years and years before you got there. But John, of course, made the infamous statement, the Bible wasn't written, it was written for us, but not to us. In other words, it was not directly to us, either in language or in time frame. And so now I've really devoted the last 40 plus years to trying to understand the greater context, especially to the Old Testament, to try to make sense of these strange and customs. Sometimes they're strange, sometimes they look almost appalling to a modern audience. And I don't know whether I've gotten very far. My joke is that maybe someday when I get older, I'll actually start studying the Bible too. Now, of course, I do study the Bible tongue in cheek, but usually it's the purpose of understanding background and figuring out all these things. And it's more than a lifetime of study. I look at it this way. I think I've scratched the surface. I'm just beginning to try to understand the literary nature of the biblical text, and then just to realize that's another lifetime of work that somebody else has worked on. So do I think I can work through it? And this takes a lot of effort. For example, learning the Akkadian language, the dialect of Babylonian and Assyrians, we had to do both. That was minimum 7 years, because you're learning a language that existed over about 3 millennia in three different time periods, different geographic regions, different, ethnic groups spoke it, etc. And so we had to learn all the different dialects and then take an exam on them after all this. And I think if I would have been told that at the beginning, I probably would have checked out. And so it was sort of a gradual thing, kind of like when you're 5 years old and mom and dad tell you you're going to kindergarten, won't this be fun? You're not going to tell them, oh, by the way, you won't be done till you're 18. And even then you're probably going to have to do some more work. And it's like, no, thank you. I'd rather go play in the backyard. And even if I was shown what the curriculum was, it's like, no, this doesn't compute. So when I look at people who work through this and they haven't gone through that rigorous program, I realize that they really don't understand the difficulty that it takes, and how sober it is. Because the first thing I learned was that my opinion wasn't particularly important, either in the classroom with the professor or anywhere else. And we were also told, yeah, you might have an opinion about something, you might even be right about it today, but we're going to go and dig something up and it'll contradict what you thought you knew. And so try to be, reserved and sober about it, because somebody's going to find something that or learn something about a text that we didn't know. And really it causes me to think the same way about the Bible, is that we've got the Bible, and I do believe in the basic theological truths of evangelical Christianity. However, when it comes to the specific details about things here and there, and what happened, for example, to Abraham in Genesis 15, that's an article I'm working on right now with that, we're not entirely sure, and it's not a bad thing to say, I really don't know what's happening. In fact, I'm probably going to say that, here and there as we move on. So anyway, so that's, and so I after my training, getting the terminal degree, the PhD, and it was very clear to us, yeah, the PhD is a union card. You get this so you can do other things, but don't think that you know a whole lot yet. You're just starting out. I was able, where do you get a job if your PhD is in, history and cuneiform languages? It's a pretty narrowly focused place, or it's a place that says, yeah, we'd like to have somebody who does ancient history and archaeology. And that was how I got to the University of Wisconsin at this regional school, La Crosse. It's a comprehensive school. And my family and I, we've been here it was 1989 when we came here. And so it's really been a wonderful place. They were about 10 years in. I asked my department chair, hey, I'd kind of like to see if I could get any students to take Babylonian. He says, well, sure, go ahead and try if you think you can get any students. I had 55 sign up the first semester, and over 30 of them lived. I mean, they all lived, but over 30 of them, finished the whole course. And then I took the second semester, and I had some students over the years that would take as many as 6 semesters of it. And then I would push them off. A couple ended up going on to grad school, but it was a lot of fun. And Babylonian, by the way, reason I keep on bringing it up is that it's a cognate language to Biblical Hebrew. If you think about it, Biblical Hebrew is a very, very small corpus. You think about it here, it's 2/3 of this book here. And though we, of course, have later rabbinical traditions, they can't inform me about how a word was used during the biblical period. All they can tell me is how they were using it now. And in the same way with English, if all I had with English was Shakespeare, the text of Shakespeare, I would learn a lot, and I could probably communicate with you. You might giggle at my thee and thou and all these other things, but but my corpus would be very fine, very small and narrowly focused. And that's what the Bible is. And that's all we have of biblical Hebrew. If we have cognate language, it's kind of like knowing Italian and finding out that, oh, there was this language called Latin that it came from. Babylonian is not a parent to biblical Hebrew, but it's a great uncle. And so there are over 2,000 words, for example, in biblical Hebrew that are only attested one time. If you can find them in cognate languages like Akkadian or Ugaritic or others, you can at least have a fighting chance to figure out what a word actually might mean in the text, and that you don't have to rely on how later authors tried to understand it in their context. It's a very, very difficult process, and there's little that can be called certainty when you deal with things like that. So you mentioned my books. The one that started off just sort of as a mild project was when John Walton called me up one day and said, "Hey, we're working on this background commentary. We've actually started," and the third guy that I had, so I wasn't even one of the top 3 that started. He says he had to back out. "Do you think you'd like to do it?" I said, "Oh, sure. All you're doing is writing up study notes." I said, "Yeah, I could do that." And we didn't realize it was going to be translated into a couple dozen languages, and so it's been a lot of fun. Yeah, here it is. That's the you can find it in I think it's in Arabic and Spanish and French and yeah, lots of different languages. But in any event, so we worked on that, and I worked on a few other projects with John. But at the time, we had no idea that it would have any significance. And like I said, it was a lot of fun to do. So anyway, so I taught at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse as a Bible-believing Christian for over 35 years. And I was the ancient person there. So I would teach courses in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. I decided to teach one on ancient Iran, ancient Turkey, just to fan out in other cuneiform areas, ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Israel. And of course, when you teach ancient Israel, it's sort of hard not to teach it without the Bible. So here I am teaching Bible as an evangelical Christian in a secular environment, which I did for 30 plus years. And how did this happen? That God had the reins to this, because here I am going off on my merry way, not knowing where this was going to end up or how it was going to work. And if I would have thought about it, like I said, I probably would have gone to a Bible college, which is fine and great. It just means that I wouldn't have been able to have this very unique circumstance.
Chavalas, thank you for that intro. Before we start diving with the giants and Genesis 6, I just want to mention my friend Ember. She's one of our fellow nerds. She's pursuing a master's in one of the seminaries. She's also very geeky when it comes to, if I can use that word, with biblical Hebrew. Yeah. First, she said, well, one of the things she said there earlier when you mentioned about the Hebrew versus the rabbis and how the rabbis couldn't tell you how the Hebrew was used in biblical times, so you have to go directly to the Bible. She said that's a great point, and she also said she loves your books, and she has one question for you. She says, and I'll share it on the screen. She said, what is the biggest misconception people have about the Akkadian language?
Oh, I don't even know whether I could even start with the misconception. Is that you think about it, language and script are not the same thing, and I'm sure that you understand that quite well. Coming, English isn't your first language, of course, if you came from overseas. But the point is that you could write any language you want with a cuneiform script, and the cuneiform script clearly was not invented for Akkadian. It was invented, in fact, I'm not even sure it was invented for Sumerian. And of course, those two languages are as close as English is to Chinese, by the way. They are the only thing that they have in common is that they're both found on planet Earth. That's about how I look at it. But it's very, Akkadian has ended up being very helpful for understanding biblical Hebrew, but it's also, I think, intimidating. And, I wrote another book, or edited a book with Lawson Younger on Mesopotamia in the Bible. And I think that I tried to, look at the history of the study of Mesopotamia. It's very new. In fact, if I look at the generations of my professors, so you were talking about the professor that you met earlier today, you could joke and call him your grand professor if he was the one who taught your professor. Well, the professor who taught my professor, Gelb, I met, I never called him my grand professor. I can go back from Gelb 3 generations, and I'm at the beginning of the decipherment of the cuneiform script. And so I'm in line like number 6 or 7. Here we are 160, 170 years later. So it's a really, really new field. And I think when the Mesopotamian stuff first began to be excavated and then deciphered and translated, it was really, really cool, except that especially people in the Victorian age were rather alarmed when they found out that the Hammurabi law code was much older than the Mosaic ones. Oh no, what do we do now? What does that mean about the Bible? And in many respects, it was a crisis of faith. And of course, it transcended that. And so, and here am I trying to tell an audience, if you understand that Abraham was a Mesopotamian himself, coming from the land of Ur of the Chaldees, he's probably ethnically an Amorite. God had to call him out of something to become the father of a nation. So if you understand that they existed in that environment, then you shouldn't be nearly as bothered by the fact that Israel looks like the other people groups that surround them, in the same way that if, let's say, God asked you to create, this is completely fictitious, and so it's going to sound ridiculous out of context. If God called you today and he wants you to start, he wants everyone to look at him in a completely different way. We've got everything wrong, and he's talking to you, and he's just given you all of these new revelations. Well, guess what? Somebody from the outside in 1,000 years is going to look and then say, Nicola, he looks just like everybody else. In fact, he leads this group. They worship on the same day. He speaks in English when he talks to them. He has his own religious study with their holy book. Looks just like all the other stuff. Why? Because you can't help it. You've been thoroughly Americanized. You're an American. You know what I'm saying is that you live here, and it's really hard not to participate in the environment, the cultural environment. You have to abide by, by the laws of America. You have to do all these things. And so from an outsider, you don't look that different. So so when I read the Bible, it's like another country. It's an alien world to me. But in fact, what really surprised me when I started teaching out here in Wisconsin, Wisconsin's a different world than California too, by the way. But when I started teaching, I found a lot of kids, especially Lutherans and Catholics, they had a hard time with the Old Testament because, of course, they had no framework for it. And they might have learned some of the Sunday school stories, but I said, I'm going to be teaching you the stuff that happens in between the stories. It's pretty tough. And then we also have a people group, a large population from Southeast Asia here, the Hmong. And when they started reading the Old Testament, and they had no framework, they were a blank slate. They came up to me and said, I really understand what's going on here. All this stuff about Abraham and his family and what they're doing, that's a lot like what we did back in the old country. And I realized, they've got a framework, a better framework to understand these strange cultures and institutions than others. And I look at Abraham, I sort of joke, Abraham was probably 100% pagan when God calls him in Genesis 12. And a couple chapters later, when he's making a covenant with him, how long did it take me to read that? 10 or 15 minutes. And so in my mind, it's like, I wonder how much less pagan Abraham is at that time. My answer is probably not a whole lot. God seems to reveal a teeny bit to him at a time, and he doesn't even tell him about monotheism at the beginning. It's like, hey, I've got a really great deal for you. Just follow me. Just go where I tell you, but I'm not going to tell you where you're ending up. It's like, okay. So back to the Akkadian port, the point is that it was, when it was found, it was intimidating because, of course, especially people in the Victorian age, they had this idea that the Bible was something that God, it came straight down from heaven, and it doesn't look like anything else on earth. But what forced us to understand that, when archaeologists began digging up Mesopotamia and Egypt, oh my goodness, that means there's a real context to this. All these peoples that they talk about are probably real. And we actually found inscriptions of Nebuchadnezzar and Sargon. It's like, wait a minute, they're not props anymore for Sunday school. They're real things. And they were interacting with Israel in the same way that, we interact with other different cultures. And there's, of course, a lot of mixing. And so my argument is that don't be afraid of studying these other things in other languages, because they're going to help you understand the Israelites better. The Israelites, if I could sum them up in one sentence, how they're different, the only thing they're different in is their perception of God and their understanding of their relationship with him. And everything else looks superficially similar, but they took it and they turned everything upside down, starting with the first verse in Genesis. But that might be another talk. I even have my own little podcast that I've started, Buried Bible Podcast, and that some of the people that are just being exposed to it are saying, what do you? I was in 10 minutes into this. This guy's talking about divination and Gilgamesh, and I just turned it off because this is fine for those who are pagans, but any self-respecting Christian wouldn't want to look at any of that stuff. And I responded to him, but I knew but there was nothing I could say to him at that point. It's like, hey buddy, I'm doing the best I can. I believe everything that you believe in, just to let you know. But I have to admit, I've been very intimidated by lots and lots of things. And there's a lot of things that I look at about the Bible and I can't make sense out of it. And A seems to contradict B and I can't figure it out, but then I have to give that over to God. I can't do it with my, so-called powers of interpretation. That's God's. And so I give it up to him. And I sort of joke that it won't change when we get to heaven, because of course, when we get to heaven, we'll be spending an eternity learning about God's infinity. And so we'll still have questions that can't be answered because we just, we couldn't bear it fully. And so we'll never get bored either. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, thank you for that. Dr. Chavalas, when it comes to the topic for tonight, can we maybe please start first with Genesis 6, making connection with the Nephilim and Rephaim, out of which one of our main characters, King Og, comes. So maybe if we can give a brief summary or overview of Genesis 6, verses 1 to 4, and then Nephilim and one of the clans that comes out of that later.
Rephaim. I have to tell you, if you would have asked me about this maybe about a decade ago, it would have been a really brief conversation. I would have said something like, yeah, that seems to be a fragment of a passage there. I don't know what's going on. So never mind. Just, we don't have enough information about it. Never mind. However, of course, part of it does have to do with my colleague Mike Heiser, who worked through this. And it's funny, when I joked with him when I met him about this, is that when I would read some of his work, I would only look at the stuff that he would say about Mesopotamia, because I want to say, all right, does he really know what's happening with Mesopotamia? Oh, he really does. oh my goodness, there's a lot more going on here. Why didn't I see that? And so it was Mike, and it was even one of my sons who got me to looking at this. Dad, it really is talking about the sons of God are heavenly beings. I said, I don't know. Sometimes that word could be used in this way. Dad, you're wrong. You need to work. You need to look through this, and I said, okay, I'll look at it. And I had to come back and say, you were right, man. So Genesis 6 is the first 4 chapters are a fragment, and it's obvious to me, or I shouldn't say that. It's going to be obvious to the listener. I'm not going to say reader, because of course the first group would have been listeners. When they're listening to these first 4 verses, there's a whole lot more going on there that they clearly understand. In the same way that, I don't know, if I say some remark about current news and I mention something about Trump or something about Biden or something about Harris, I don't have to say a whole lot to you, because you seem to be breathing and you're cognizant. So it's been already exploding, like through your mind, right or wrong, conservative or liberal or whatever, it doesn't even matter. It's like, yeah, I sort of know all that about that, and so I don't have to explain it. Or if I wrote a novel about a cat, I probably wouldn't start by telling you in the first 5 pages what a cat was. It's like, hey man, there's cats everywhere. But in 5,000 years, when cats are gone, and we have this introduction to what cats are in my novel, it's going to be the most important book, on cats. So the point is that the writer is assuming that the listener knows all about this stuff. The problem is that you think about it. How often do these things in Genesis 6 come up again in the Old Testament? A couple of times in a couple of isolated places, in Numbers, in Deuteronomy, and then in Joshua. And then, of course, the Og isn't the last giant. I think it's Goliath, by the way. Goliath is from Gath, and they talk about all that stuff. But the point is, and so I look at this and say, all right, so I had this problem, and it was in my craw, and I couldn't get rid of it. It's like the New Testament writers twice seem to allude to this stuff, and it's so obvious that when Jude and 1st and 2nd Peter talk about this. By the way, Jude and 2nd Peter, even though they are traditionally different authors, they seem to share a brain. But when you look at the passages, and I don't need, we can go into them if you want to, but for sake of time, I'll just allude to them. They clearly are talking about the fact that Genesis 6 is talking about heavenly beings. The sons of God are clearly heavenly beings that are coming down and having, sexual interaction with human women. And it's like, oh, that doesn't seem to, first of all, that doesn't appeal to my modern sensibilities. You think about it, the modern Christian, in many respects, has been secularized because of the scientific revolution. So we can think about the resurrection's really cool, God is out there and all these things. But when it comes to really mythological stuff, I especially as Presbyterian background, it's like, yeah, I'd rather just avoid that. But I could not avoid it when I really, connected the dots with 2nd Peter and Jude. They are clearly talking about that. Well, where did they get that? Because they also seem to think that their readers understand all about this too. And one area that I have been very weak in, and I'm trying to evaluate, is in my minor degrees were in Greek and Roman period history, and so I was at least have a nice background, and I did it primarily for the it's funny, when I first started teaching it with Western civilization, it became world civilization rather soon. But I thought, well, if I study Mesopotamia, if I do Greece and Rome, then at least I'll have a good solid background to teach Western civilization somewhere. And then of course they changed that. But the point was, I had that background, but what I didn't have was the Jewish environment And the New Testament, of course, is a Jewish book, is written by, I think probably every single person was Jewish. And even when they're writing in Greek, it's probably not their first language. And so they're writing in this environment. So but I knew little about that context. And so I knew about the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha, and I read this stuff, and I certainly knew about the Talmudic material and other rabbinical texts, but they were not on my radar, and they were not on my academic radar. In fact, another very odd thing about me, well, there's lots of them, but is that I did not get biblical Hebrew training, because when I went to UCLA, they only had advanced biblical Hebrew. So I took Ugaritic and, of course, Akkadian. So I took cognate languages, but I didn't take the biblical Hebrew language. And so I sort of learned it through the back door. And it's sort of an ad hoc learning. Don't ask me about, grammatical and semantic issues. It would be dangerous. So anyway, so it forced me to realize, okay, there is an environment and there's a history of thinking that the material in Genesis 6 at the beginning are talking about these really, really strange creatures, and so I can't ignore it any longer. And so I delved into First Enoch, because to me, Mike Heiser, even himself, he's so nonplussed in the sense, I just read this stuff and I got this and I got that and I got this. And I'm thinking, yeah, but nobody's put all that together before, man. And, and not only that, his background, because I know a good deal about his background for a variety of reasons, but he had very, very solid theological training first. Then he went to a place like Dallas Seminary, got language training, and then he asked too many questions. So he decided, well, I better start. So he went to Penn State and then the UW-Madison. So he was there, by the way. I actually taught an Akkadian class at Madison. It was probably just after he was there. And so our paths never actually crossed for many years. But his training is so detailed and took so many years to get to the point of him doing this. And so it's not something for the faint of heart to just start jumping in and thinking, yeah, I can just jump into this stuff. Mike had decades of training before he was working on this material. And his command of the secondary sources was amazing. And even though he was not a Mesopotamian scholar, I'd say he knows where to find all this stuff. Because he was just very well read. In fact, I even went up to Lagos where he was, and I went up there twice to do lectures, and both times, of course, he wasn't there. He was gone. So in any event, but he forced me to look at this stuff. And so I started reading First Enoch. Oh my goodness. Now, by the way, Enoch is not, I know that the Ethiopian church sees it as canonical. I don't think it is, but just because a book isn't canonical doesn't mean it doesn't have great value to it. And so I don't read it uncritically. I have looked at people on the internet who, when they start making all these connections, and that the problem is they're taking every book and they're mining every book for information rather than trying to understand the context of the information, where it was, who wrote it, why they wrote it, who is it for, etc. I have to do that the same thing for the Bible too. And so when I look at First Enoch, I'm aware of the fact that it has a tremendous expansion of understanding of what's happening here. Of course, it provides names of these creatures, these nephilim, by the way, and I'm not either a Hebrew or Aramaic scholar, and so I don't know enough about it, but I know that Nephilim, though it's been traditionally translated as fallen ones, that's not how the Septuagint writers translated it. They clearly translated it as gigantes, and that's the tradition that you can tell permeates the intertestamental periods and the New Testament and beyond. They clearly saw it as that way. And perhaps there is this Aramaic root giants also, but I don't know enough about it to say anything credible about it. But so if that is the case, of course, if they aren't giants, then what's the issue with the biblical writers? Clearly thought it was giants, because whenever the Nephilim are mentioned, of course, they're hardly ever mentioned again. And the actual word Nephilim is hardly ever mentioned, but it's connected to the Rephaim and the Anakim and the others. And it'll give us the names of some of these individuals like Og. And though it doesn't actually say Goliath is, well, it calls him a giant, of course. It doesn't call him a Nephilim, but the fact that he's from Gath, which is an area that was traditionally understood to have the giants, it's a no-brainer that they existed. So now, but this was not the kicker for me. The kicker was when I went into Mesopotamia. Okay. Now, I sent you that article by what's her name? The 1987 article by Anne Draftcorn Kilmer, who is a Mesopotamian scholar. And by the way, Mesopotamian scholars at the very outset were dependent upon Hebrew training. And so they sort of had a complex at the beginning. We want to study Mesopotamia for its own sake. And so, in fact, my primary professor was a devout Catholic. Yes, that's the article. It's pretty obscure, by the way. It's not easy to find. But I was able to, in fact, I had to end up going to my library and asking them to order it for me so I could get it. But she wrote this about 40 years ago. Anne was a wonderful lady, brilliant scholar. I got to meet her one or two times. And she just passed away recently, about the age of 90. I think it was last year. And when we had our national conference at Berkeley 30 some years ago, she was just a very, very nice host, and whoever she was talking to, she made you feel like you were the most important person at that moment. She began to make the connection between the Nephilim, these giants, and what they do, and a group called in Akkadian the Apkallu. It's a Sumerian loan word, Abgal. It certainly means something like great princes or great princely ones in Sumerian. And just to show you the difference between the languages, so the term in Sumerian Abgal, the Akkadians, when they took the word as a loan word, by the way, loan words aren't loan words because you never give them back. So it became Apkallu. They put their ending on it, and they, of course, pronounced it a little differently. The Apkallu, by the way, there are no myths about the Apkallus that we've found. They are mentioned in, I don't know, there are dozens of texts which talk about them, but they're never the main topic of any of the texts. Kind of like the Anunnaki that we might talk about a little bit later. And by the way, this is pretty typical of Mesopotamia, is that when you're dealing with documents, it's as if you have a giant, let's say you have a giant puzzle of 1,000 pieces, and I'm telling you, all right, go ahead and work on the puzzle. And you come back to me a couple of days later and said, I'm missing 648 pieces. I said, yeah, too bad. Tell me what you think it looks like after putting 300 together. Actually, probably worse than that. You're probably missing 900 pieces of the 1,000-piece puzzle. And I said, we might find 2 or 3 more pieces for you in the next couple of weeks, and maybe in your lifetime we'll find another 40 or 50. And so you're basically helping the next generation figure out what that piece is. And so, but the Apkallu are like that. There is no text explaining who they are, no manual telling us anything. We have anecdotal pieces of information. And this is sort of analogous to stuff in the Bible, because if you think about it, because of for obvious reasons, over the past couple of generations, we've been very interested in women in the Bible because we're interested in how women interact in as a cultural phenomena over the past, couple of generations. But you can ask that question of the Bible, but I'm pretty convinced that the Bible isn't particularly interested in answering that question directly. Like, is there a particular passage that tells you about, women and their relationship? Well, maybe a sentence or two in Genesis 2, but the point is you're not going to get the information that you want. If you want to ask about, what was going on in heaven before God, made the universe, that seems to be classified information, and so we have little tiny pieces of information here and there that will allude to something. You say, wait a minute, what's that alluding to? And why don't I know about it? Well, we are a couple thousand years removed from it, and we're speaking a different language. And so, in fact, if you think about it, all I'm trying to do is get back to where we were a couple thousand years ago in our understanding. It's almost as if it's an incredible anachronism, and it's not like we're learning anything new. We're learning stuff that's really, really old that's now coming back to the surface. So with them, so how are the Apkallu described? The Apkallu are described as sages. And by the way, I worked through all this, and I gave a couple talks on this, and then all of a sudden, one of my colleagues, Jack Sasson, has a news source, and you can sign up for this if you're a Mesopotamia geek, ancient Near Eastern geek, and he'll send out news sources, kind of like CNN or whatever. You get these news feeds, and one day he sends a note about a new book called "In Search of the Seven Sages" of ancient Mesopotamia. I'm thinking, oh, I could have used that book, and it's 600 pages, and this lady who I did not know her, Josephine Fechner, who's a German, wrote it in English because she probably wanted others to read it. Spends basically 600 pages letting you know that there are a few literary traditions, fragments of traditions that we've tried to piece together about the Apkallu. Lots of iconographic information. They kind of look like fishmen, by the way. There's always 7 of them, except when there aren't. And they are described similarly to what First Enoch says. By the way, when I talk about First Enoch now, like I said, it's not canonical, but it's very helpful and informational. But I have to be aware that it is not Holy Scripture, so I'm not going to take it as such. But it can be helpful. It helps me understand it, and it informs me of other things. But it doesn't necessarily mean that everything in it is correct. It talks about the ancients, and it's also like another. I'll get back to her in a minute. It's also like another source, a classical source, Berosus, who was a Mesopotamian priest living in the Hellenistic period, who, in fact, he's actually basically a Babylonian Josephus. His goal is to try to help the Greeks and others understand the antiquity of his great people. Manetho did it for the Egyptians. Josephus basically does it for the Jews. And Berosus did it for Babylonians. That's the good news. The bad news is his work didn't survive except through fragments of other writers, including Josephus and a few other Christian writers. And so we've tried to piece together Berosus. And in fact, one of my teachers, Stanley Burstein, wrote an article on Berosus. Berosus is trying to understand Mesopotamian history, and maybe I'll tell you a couple of words about what Berosus. By the way, we've always had this because because he's being mentioned in Josephus, but Berosus talks a little bit about. Where did he go here? I'll get him in a second here. That's antiquities. Oh, here we go. So Berosus is talking about the fact how did humans get their sciences and crafts, etc. Well, they got them from the sages. Okay. And it's not unlike what's going on here in not so much in Genesis 6, because the point of Genesis 6 is to explain how they were bad and why God had to act on this. And then but it's expanded upon in First Enoch. I know this is all very confusing, but this is how historians work, by the way. We have to take a piece here and a piece there from another time period and then evaluate whether it's, makes sense, and then try to see these connections, and then bring this to a group of people at a conference who will tell you, oh yeah, we already tried that. That's really silly. No, forget that one, and that one. Oh, this one idea over here looks like it might go. And so in other words, you're forcing yourself to be accountable to a bunch of other people. You used to do it in graduate, seminars. Now you're doing it at sessions. And then you'll go away thinking, wow, I thought I had some good ideas. I had 16 good ideas and 3 of them are left with me now. So anyway, so Berosus, by the way, here's Berosus. He's a classical scholar writing in Greek. And so that means if you're a Mesopotamian scholar, you want to read Berosus, you have to know classical Greek now. It's like, wait a minute, that's not fair. But it is. And so this is what Berosus says in his prologue. By the way, he talks about the flood too, fragments of the flood here and there. And Berosus clearly knew his Mesopotamian stuff, but he's living in the 3rd century BC near the very end of it. He says, in the first year, of the existence, there's a beast called Oannes appeared from the sea in a place adjacent to Babylonia. His entire body was a fish, but it had a human head that had grown beneath the head of a fish. I don't know what's going on here, but he had a human voice. And by the way, this is probably the mythical Adapa who was mentioned in Mesopotamian sources, but he gave human sciences and crafts of all time. He taught them how to found cities, establish temples, introduce laws, and measure land. This is precisely what First Enoch is saying about in their Jewish version of what's happening. So, all right. So what about, okay, that's Berosus. What about the Mesopotamian texts? Oh yeah, that's where, I had to come up with this, and I wrote a book. The only way that I could get this book and afford it was to write a book review, because if you write a book review, you get the book free. I said, that's a good deal. So of course I had to find somebody who wanted me to review it. So I had a friend who was a book review editor, said, hey, I got this really cool book. I like to review for you. Hint, hint, can you get it for me? He says, oh yeah, that'd be cool. So we got it, and I reviewed the book, and now I have the book. So anyway, I want to read just a couple sentences of what I write here, because I say this is a great work on a seemingly obscure topic, even for Mesopotamian studies, an exhaustive study on the textual iconographic references to the 7 sages of Mesopotamia, commonly known in Akkadian as the Apkallu. And like I mentioned earlier, Andrafkorn Kilmore was the one who began to make this connection almost 40 years ago. But here's the problem. Mesopotamian scholars like to go on their Mesopotamian way. Biblical scholars usually like to go on their biblical way. And there aren't very many people who are in between. And if there are, they're usually, it's sort of nervous, because, so for example, if I go to Mesopotamian conferences, I'm the biblical guy. If I go to a biblical conference, I'm the Mesopotamian guy. So it's like, yeah, you got one foot in the middle. There were very few people who were able to flawlessly go back and forth. One of my grand professors was Bill Hallow, and he was one of the guys who was equally adept in both areas. And I have a number of colleagues of my own who I think have been able to do the same thing. Lawson Younger, who I mentioned, was one of them. Richard Averbeck and John Walton, of course, certainly was able is able to do that. I shouldn't say was. They're all still kicking, and so here's the problem. We have all these fragments of sources, and I'm going to just mention some of these sources and what they bring up, and they're analogous to what's happening in the Enoch source about the they don't. I don't even know if I don't remember if they even use the word nephilim. They call them by different names. One of them is watchers, which, by the way, actually is a term that is used for the Apkallu in a couple of places. And so it's not, and of course it's in the book of Daniel. And so I say and so when Fechner talks about the connection between the Apkallu and the Bible, it's 5 pages out of 600. Okay. And so it's like, by the way, the tradition did end up, going into other areas. In fact, she even traces it into Greece and connects them with the Titans, which I think it's stretching it at one point, but she is so thorough that I can see it. So anyway, the Mesopotamian texts that talk about the Apkallu and their sage-like information, there's only about half a dozen of them. And like I said, they're never the main text. But here's where they are. You would never guess this. They are described in incantation series. And so if I'm, what's an incantation for? It's to try to rid you of some terrible evil, usually demonic or witch evil, etc. And so you are trying to remove that thing that is there. And when they're calling upon the Apkallu, it's actually to get them out of the way. They're considered to be irritants by humans in later periods, not the good guys, which is precisely what you find in First Enoch and in the Bible, of course. And I think somebody reading Genesis 6, and I think Genesis 1 through 11 has so many interconnections with Babylon. And though I don't want to go into authorship right now because we would never get out of it, I think that if you look at the final edition of Genesis through 2 Kings, which I still think is divinely inspired, but the final edition is probably a communal thing. And they may be in the same way that if I give you an edition of Shakespeare, but I decided to put my notes in to intersperse them as commentary, intersperse them in the middle of the text. And here you are reading it and say, I can't tell which part is Shakespeare and what part is Chavalas' commentary. I think that sometimes happens with the Bible. Even the term Chaldean, when it talks about the Chaldees, that's clearly a late addition. There are no Chaldeans during the period of Abraham. So the writer assumes that the reader understands what these traditions, and so they don't have to go into them here. They don't have to explain it. But these Mesopotamian texts, the Bit Mashiri incantation series, Bit Mashiri is basically a house of I don't know, you're binding. You're trying to bind the bad stuff. They have incantations, and they actually mentioned who the Apkallu are by name, and it's sort of an interesting commentary on this. I know Kilmer actually has this, and so they mention first the Apkallu Uana. That, by the way, Uana is the same name that Berosus had told us. Uanas, who completed the plans of heaven and earth. Well, that's pretty powerful. Uanaduga, by the way, these are all nice Sumerian names, by the way, if you're wondering, who was endowed with comprehensive intelligence. Enmeduga, who was allotted a good fate. Enmegalama, who was born in a house. Wow, that was nice. Enmebeluga, who grew up on a pasture land. Anenlilda, the exorcist of Eridu. Eridu, by the way, for Mesopotamia was the first town. And I'm guessing it probably is biblical Irad, which is mentioned in I think it's Genesis 5 as one of the towns. It might be a match. It'd be fun that it's a match. You just don't like to be dogmatic about things like that, because something's going to happen in a week that will show you that it was absolutely wrong or absolutely right. Then it calls about somebody, Utu Abzu or Adapa, who ascended to heaven. And then it says total 7 brilliant Purudu fish. They're called fish, born in a river, who directed the plans of earth. And then after the flood, there are more Apkallu. And I won't say all their names. They're all good Sumerian names, who brought down Ishtar from heaven, who made the harp decorated from bronze. One of them angered Adad, one of them angered Ea. These are gods. And the one who angered Ea basically confined them to the netherworld. That's interesting. And then it doesn't mention them interacting with humans, but the next Apkallu is only 2/3 Apkallu. And by the way, the most famous of all the Apkallu, by the way, is because he's mentioned this only one time somewhere, because it means wise sage, is Gilgamesh, by the way. And he's, of course, 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. And how does that work? I don't know. It's probably not a treatise on medicine or biology any more than Genesis 1 is a treatise on biology, or Genesis 3 is a treatise on zoology to try to figure out what the snake is, or whatever that thing is. So we have incantations like this. And most of the texts are negative about them. In other words, these guys are intimidating. They're sort of scary. Let's see if we can bind them. And so you're the average Mesopotamian. Bad things happen to you, and their explanation for bad things to happen is because you did something wrong. And so you've got to figure out what you did wrong. But of course, you've got to pay me money to find out. And so for you doing something wrong, pay me money and I'll find out, you actually angered this particular deity when you said such and such. This is no different than Greece and Rome, by the way. And give me some money, we'll do an incantation. You'll have to do something that's impossibly hard, because you'll have to do this 3 times and go around your house, and then a week later do this on the river, etc. It's kind of like having a strong password. You never get it right when you're trying to plug it in. And then hopefully it'll rid you of this demonic problem or whatever it might be, and just don't do that thing again that you did. But the Apkallu are thrown together with other beings as being, demonic in the sense that they're not necessarily friendly to humans. They might have been friendly at the beginning. And then when you look at little things in Genesis 6, for those of us who, like to think the flood is something, worldwide, the problem with Genesis, 6 is, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and afterwards too. Like, wait a minute, how'd they get there afterwards? Were they on the ark? 2 of them on the ark with Noah? It's like, don't even ask. It's like, that question is not resolved. And I learned a long time ago not to worry about having all of my theological ducks in a row when I'm studying the Old Testament. It's a really, it's a different country. It's a really difficult one. And I suppose I'm of the mindset that this is really fun. I enjoy doing this, even if I can't always figure something out. And if I can't, I'll just keep on trying. So anyway, when I found that there were multiple Mesopotamian texts that talked about a group, the Apkallu, that seemed to be like the nephilim. By the way, Gilgamesh is described as a giant in an Ugaritic text of all places, because Gilgamesh and the epic was really, really famous and went, we have Gilgamesh fragments as far south as Hatzor, even though the cuneiform tradition didn't seem to go very far south for a while, and maybe until the Amarna age, it got at least a Hatzor, and maybe the rest of the area was probably a cuneiform wasteland. So anyway, it forced me to realize, all right, there is a connection between Genesis 6 and the New Testament passages, first Enoch, Berosus, and then my own stomping grounds, Mesopotamia. When I was able to put that on it, it's like, okay, I cannot deny this any longer. I was, it was wrong before, and so it was wrong because I didn't want to. I was avoiding it. And there's by the way, there's still dozens and dozens and dozens of other passages that I've just been sort of like, yeah, I'm just going to ignore that right now. That's too difficult. So now what do you do with this when you have the understanding is that we have this Mesopotamian connection? How does this help me? How does this inform me about what's going on too in the Bible with these other groups? Because, like I said, whenever the Nephilim or their ilk are described later on, it's anecdotal. It's never the main topic, in my opinion. And so I think that, first of all, it gets to be a little dangerous if you make it the main topic. If it doesn't seem to be of first rank importance to the writer, then I should probably look at it the same way. Not that it's unimportant at all. It's just that they're not making a big deal to talk about the Nephilim. And so, maybe it's like taking intellectual blood out of our turnip to try to figure this out. They're not trying to answer the questions that we're having about all this stuff. Who are these guys? Where do they show up? And what does this mean? They probably assume that the listeners of that period and later periods are fully aware of this tradition. And so I don't know where you want to go from here. I mean, I suppose I can get to the Og story. Like I said, Og's not really been on my radar, except other than the fact that, he just happens to be there and he's got a cool bed.
Yeah, that is very important, but also because you mentioned Gilgamesh, I also want to say that the data we find that he was supposedly tall 11 cubits, while for people who want to, compare, Goliath was said to have 6 cubits. So Gilgamesh supposedly was almost twice bigger, and 9 cubits is the height measurement for King Og. So maybe we can go with Deuteronomy 3, the feet of King Og, and especially when it comes to his bed measurements, relationship with God Marduk, and then we can touch that with the relationship of the divine sexual rights, what will happen there. And I think that will give an explanation of why were creatures or people like Gilgamesh supposed to be 2/3 divine because of that sexual right. But yeah, we can go with King Og and then Deuteronomy 3, his defeat, and then his bed measurements, and parallel to God Marduk and his bed.
Well, first of all, the beds, those aren't the only beings with beds. Humans have royal beds like this too, and so in other words, it's not simply the prerogative of divine. So the mere fact that Og has a big bed and Marduk has a big bed of the same size does mean something, but it doesn't mean as much as I think people would like to make it. Og is not Marduk. He's not divine. He's a Nephilim. So what does that mean? That means that he's the product of a heavenly being and an earthly being. And probably nothing more, nothing less. The fact that his bed is big doesn't mean that he's as big as his bed, by the way. He could be, but I'm not going to measure the bed and say, if I sleep in a king size bed, it doesn't make me 6'8" just because I sleep in one. You know,
I know. I used to have king size bed. It's like for 3 people almost.
yeah, exactly. You know, I could put my whole gang in the bed. All right, great, that's fun. But I didn't grow just to be, just to have the bed. So I really like, the LINDQUIST article in Catholic Biblical Quarterly for about. It had been on my radar to look at, and then you mentioned it, so it was really nice to be able to look at this. Is that, the bed is a battle trophy, and so I think I would rather talk about what happens to the Marduk bed. When the Assyrians came down and destroyed Babylon during the time of Sennacherib, they took Marduk's bed with them. You're thinking, now, it was bad enough that they took his statue, but they also took his bed. And of course, the bed is where you have your, what do you want to say? You have your prowess in this, and your divine prowess. And so it means that we're taking your God and his implements with us, which makes him sort of secondary. He's no longer significant as he used to be. He got a demotion because, of course, Marduk was the king of the gods. But when he gets up to Assyria, it's Ashur. And so he's, in fact, the Assyrians have their own version of the creation epic, and it's Ashur who does everything, not Marduk. And the one god that's missing is Enlil, which is he was probably the original one in perhaps in the earliest traditions, but we just don't have them any longer. So, but other kings had beds like this too, and whether or not they enacted the sacred marriage on these things it's all circumstantial. It never is told. We're never told that directly. And so if I make those connections, I'm trying to remember being in graduate school. If you made connections like that when they weren't obvious, you were struck down, with a mace at that point. It's like, no, you can't do that yet. There's no, you got A, you got C, and you got G, but you don't have B and all these things. So you can't put them in. And that's, of course, that's Mesopotamian scholarship, by the way. And so we look at that and say, well, you got Marduk's bed. It's described. And by the way, when it's returned, we don't know whether it's the same bed, whether the dimensions are the same. But the fact that the biblical writer is describing the dimensions which are there during the period of Sennacherib might tell me something about the fact that the text in Deuteronomy is maybe an editorial statement that makes more sense to the later period. I don't know. And it's also it almost might be a way of dissing their Babylonian overlords by by the way, Og had a bed just like Marduk. Isn't that funny? And even the story of Babel right now, the Babel story, a lot of the terminology, this just came out in an article a year ago by Casey Clam. She's arguing now that the Enuma Elish has or the biblical narrative about Babel is got a lot of information that is remarkably reminiscent of the Enuma Elish, the creation epic, down to, the exact phrases. And so they're mocking them in many respects. So the same thing might be happening here. But I don't know. We don't have enough information to talk about it. And so the point is this: the fact that Og has a bed that's the same size as Marduk doesn't mean that everything that Og does is the same as Marduk. I don't identify Og with Marduk, and I know that people have done that, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, you've made all of these comparisons that would cause a Mesopotamian scholar to cringe and like I said, to go back to graduate school and realize I would get schooled by this. And this is why I appreciated something like Mike Heiser. Mike Heiser was so nonplussed by taking this, and this. And he said, well, this scholar did this, and this scholar did this, and this scholar did this. And well, I'm not gonna, but they all put these together like this. And so I'm simply collecting them for you. And his big gift was that he was able to do that and then make it palatable to a public. But if you have somebody else who's not understanding how to do that, and there's making all these connections, it's pretty sensationalistic, and it sort of rushes over Mesopotamian studies like a steam shovel, I suppose. Like, wait a minute, some of us have been doing this for 50 years, and we were able to figure that out, and you figured it out in a week. That's impressive if it were true. So Og has all I can tell you is Og has a bed like Marduk. That means, but other people have beds too. And so the point is that Marduk got toasted. So, and he's going to be toasted. And so Og was too, and he was defeated. And how would the writer know about Og's bed anyway? Well, maybe we have it. I mean, because it seems, if you think about it, when you read it seems like one of the most random statements imaginable. Like, do I really care? That'd be like somebody saying, hey, do you know every president, this is the president that Biden used, and this is the one that Trump used. I'm thinking, wait a minute, I really don't care. I'm more interested in their policies or lack thereof. I don't care about their beds. So why do we need to know this? It's the connection with Marduk, but it doesn't make Og a god. Like I said, it doesn't make him performing sacred marriage rituals or any of this other stuff. And so, so for me, I sort of glaze over that from that standpoint. It's I don't know, a misdirected. And I think that both LINDQUIST and the other article by, what's her name? Is it Quist? I forget now. But anyway, I think both of them, though they had different interest in it, they certainly understand the Mesopotamian connection and realize that the connection is probably a singular one about a victory bed and nothing else.
Yeah, I think you're talking about Lara Quick.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that what you said about Og and Marduk, yeah, there's no relationship from other scholars, including Heiser, that I read in the sense that Og is divine or something like that. But I think they're trying to make, including Heiser and some other authors, I think they're trying to make an argument. Well, we don't know, like you said, we are not told how their giants or nephilim or one of the tribes, including Rephaim, how were they able to, exist after the flood? Well, we don't know exactly, but one of the things is through this divine sexual rite that is still, for example, practiced in modern day Japan by the presidents. So they said this bed, in a way, reminds us of Marduk. And this bed would be where the temple prostitute, where the temple prostitute would come and have a sexual relationship with the king.
Right, and by the way, the sacred marriage ritual is known as early Sumerian times, and so that's to me that's not a problem. Although I would not want to connect that to the problem of the Nephilim before and after the flood. It's stated there, and it doesn't have any issue concerning whether, in other words, we're asking the question, wait a minute, if the flood's worldwide and everybody got destroyed, how are the Nephilim around? I don't think there's anything here that allows me to figure it out at all. And, does that mean that the flood is it literary hyperbole? I mean, the Bible uses this quite often. So, for example, in Genesis 19, when Lot's hanging out in Sodom, it says the entire town to the last man surrounded his house. You're thinking, well, that would be pretty hard. I mean, how could the entire town surround the house? And of course, it's like me saying, oh yeah, I was watching this football game yesterday and the Rams destroyed the Bears. The Bears, they defeated them down to the last man. Well, everyone knows that the Bears weren't killed. It just means that they really got a solid defeat. And so I'm hyperbolizing. The Bible does that quite often. You think of, what is it, Judges 4, when Deborah and Barak defeat the armies of Sisera, the Canaanites. It says they were defeated down to the last man. And in the very next verse, the very next verse, the last man existed. In other words, Sisera ran away. Wait a minute. I thought everybody was killed. No, there's one guy left. And so clearly that's a literary device that everyone would have understood in the ancient world. And we get queasy about it because, well, it's the Bible. How could they use literature like that? Well, they do. How can I be certain about it? Well, you can't. It's God that you're certain on, not your ability. So I'm not ready to do that. I'm not ready to take the sacred marriage ritual and attach it to the Nephilim story and to Gog to explain how they can exist before and after the flood. My answer is, yeah, it says they do. And to me, that's grasping for things that maybe we'll find a text that does something like that at some point. But I have enough time dealing with the text that I can look at and make connections with. So I'm not ready to do that yet. And maybe part of it is me not studying this particular area enough yet. Because like I said before, Og wasn't on my radar. So, okay, yeah, the Nephilim, a couple of them are named. And I didn't realize, and maybe I need to be more aware of what's happening out there in internet land with some of these things. In fact, I had no idea that the Anunnaki were a big deal outside of Mesopotamian studies until recently. And then I got my head gasket blown by that. And so I'm finding out that Og there too. And I mean, I've seen people write that, Og has a Sumerian equivalent. No, he doesn't. Og is Og, whatever that means. And he's an Amorite. And are all the Amorites big? No, because I think Abraham was an Amorite and some were giants and most aren't. And, that's another issue.
Yeah, thanks for that. If it's okay, just for the sake of audience who like piling up information, taking notes, I'll just read the one short paragraph from Jastro. And I know it's 100-year-old article, and I know you told me since then we learned a lot, but I think it will be still cool for people who are like trying to find some explanations and relationship. I'll just read quickly.
Before you do, I'll tell you, I'm standing on his shoulders, and so he's 100 years old. It's the only problem with Jastro is that he doesn't have the information that I have 100 years later. That's all. And so when I use Jastro, it's because I'm trying to learn how we got our progression of knowledge. But yes, go for it. I can comment on him.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That would be good. Thank you. So pages 118 and 119, and you can find this PDF on JSTOR, maybe even Academia. You can look for this article.
Yes, very easy.
Yeah. So this is the quote: "The scene of the union between the god, small g, God, and the goddess sheds a new light on the well-known account given by Herodotus on the sacred room at the top of the ziggurat, or stage tower of the god Marduk at Babylon, where there was a richly adorned couch occupied by a woman chosen for himself by the deity out of all the women in the land, and by the god who comes down in person into this chamber and sleeps upon the couch." Herodotus naively adds that he does not credit the tale, but the meaning of it's perfectly clear. The god, in this case Marduk, was no doubt represented by a priest, while the woman, who had to be a virgin, represents the goddess. Marduk's festival in the New Year's tide, celebrated in the spring of the year, and it is reasonable inference that the marriage of Marduk and his consort Zarpanit was symbolically represented at the time of the vernal equinox by the deflowering of a virgin through a priest, so as to ensure the fertility of the fields. And I'll stop here. I have more quotations, but that's a lengthier one from some other authors, including Kingship and the Gods, which is a public available PDF, the whole book to be downloaded. They explain more of this sexual ritual. And some of these rituals may differ. They may say, oh, it was a king who actually represents the deity, or they may say it was a priest, or they will say it's a king and the temple prostitute, or maybe a priestess. So if a king was in a way divine, semi-divine, that represented God, and a priestess served her goddess, and then the baby that will come out of that lady in that sexual rite will be, well, 2/3 divine, because it will come from a god and a goddess that will basically almost not possess but dwell in the king and the priestess. Yes. And the baby will be 1/3 human only, which we see again in the cases of for example, the Gilgamesh whom we mentioned before. So yeah, if you can please comment on Jastro's article.
Well, first of all, since he mentions Herodotus, I did actually write an article on Herodotus and what he says about Babylonian women in Herodotus in book 180. I don't know, couple verses past this, he talks about the fact that Babylonian women have to go and prostitute themselves at the temple, and I tried to find what was going on in Mesopotamia to connect it to Herodotus, and it was exceedingly hard. It shows me that Herodotus probably learned about Babylonian culture from educated priests, but he really didn't understand what he was learning. And so he made a myriad of mistakes. So for example, just to show you about Herodotus, because here's Jastrow telling us this, I guess probably the beginning of the 20th century. And so we're just beginning to learn about Mesopotamian traditions. And so he's connecting them with what Herodotus said about what's happening on the top of a ziggurat. And they're pretty uncritical about what Herodotus is saying and doing. We've gone to the point of Herodotus knew all about Babylon, to no, he never went there and he was a liar, to now, yeah, actually he did know some things, but he misconstrued what he was seeing. So for example, when Herodotus talks about medicine, he says that Babylonians had no doctors. They just brought a person out to the street and asked a passerby. Well, he probably experienced something and misunderstood it, because they had tons of medical experts and what we would call witch doctors and doctors. And so, what was he thinking? He's not making it up. He's not making this stuff up either, but Jastrow didn't have the context yet, because we didn't have the information to try to put this into context. In fact, this might be something fun for me to write an article on, is Herodotus in this section. Is this the New Year's festival? I don't know. Is it the sacred marriage? It's hard to say. I'd have to look and see what a couple of Near Eastern scholars have said about this Herodotus. By the way, it really, just like in biblical studies, classical studies and Mesopotamian studies also sort of mix like oil and water. It's not easy to find someone. I went to a seminar years ago, an NEH seminar at Cornell, and I was the Mesopotamian scholar amongst a bunch of classicists, and I would start making connections in this. What is this? This is ridiculous. This is not, this does not compute. And I couldn't express it in a way that made sense even to the guy who was leading the seminar. And so I realized, all right, I'm learning some things, but I'm not going to get anywhere. Even if this is all correct, I still don't know how to connect this with the Nephilim, just because of the union between the heavenly beings and the earthly beings. In other words, is that analogous to the sacred marriage ritual? I don't want to take that uncritically, as if it's the same thing. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And maybe somebody's done an article, and I actually haven't looked at this yet. I'm going to go take a look at it. It came out 10 years ago, but Doak's book, The Last of the Rephaim, Conquest and Cataclysm, in the heroic ages of ancient Israel. I'd like to take a look at that. It just hasn't been on my radar, and so when I get that, I'll take a look and see if there's a more critical eye, because it's really, really hard for somebody to make generalizations about Israel, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, and be authoritative about all those connections. There's nobody can have an intimate understanding of all that material and have a command of all that material. It's just impossible in one lifetime. And so I had minor fields in Greece and Rome, so at least I can look at the material and I sort of know who did what and who's important and who isn't. But I can't go a whole lot further than that. And so I can take a look at somebody like Doak and see whether he's making all those connections, and whether it sounds right or I just don't know. But I'm suspicious of connecting the Nephilim and Og and all those with sacred marriage ritual. It doesn't seem like a good match to me yet. But the jury's out.
Yeah, I think I also want to say the same thing about Henry Frankfurt's Kingship and the God. That's the book that is available online for free. Yeah. I'll just read very briefly one of the passages from chapter 21. He's speaking, okay. So he's speaking about a king whose name is extremely hard to pronounce, Ama Ushumgal Ana, which says the great ruler of heaven. An epithet of Tammuz, one of the deities, are used alternatively when reference to the bridegroom is made. And this willful confusion of God and king fusion is a more appropriate term, continues when the emergence of the couple from the bedchamber is described. Thus, the king of Isin acted as part of the god, in contrast with Egypt, where a god took the part of a king in the sexual act. The distinction is important, even though in practice in both places we find a king incarnating a god, small g. The purpose of the right to guard the life breath of all the lands is in keeping with what we know of the New Year's festival. The union of the god and goddess vouchsafed prosperity for the year to come and was followed by a banquet which cast the spell of abundance, which the right, objectivating the seasonal forces, attempted to ensure. And this is also interesting. Next page. King Ishmet Dagon said of himself, I'm whom Inanna, queen of heaven and earth, has chosen for her beloved husband. In the epic of Gilgamesh, it is Ishtar who invites the king of Erech to become her husband. Perhaps we hold here the clue to the problem of deification of kings in Mesopotamia. It may well be that only those kings were deified who had been commended by a goddess to share her couch. Our assumption seems to find support in a text known as deification of Lipit Ishtar, and so on and so. But very interesting from another scholar. I don't know if you would like to comment on this.
Yeah, Frankfurt, by the way, was actually a giant in Egyptology, but he was so brilliant, he crossed over and was able to work on this material and have a command of it. But he was not a Mesopotamian scholar, but that's all right. I don't have a problem with that. This was written about 70, just after World War II, when Frankfurt was flourishing at the University of Chicago. So if he wanted to know something about Mesopotamia, all he had to do was go down the hall and the center of at the Oriental Institute. He could talk to anybody about it. And of course, he wrote works with Jacobson and others. And so I have no problem with that at all. But when I look at the sacred marriage ritual, conceptually they're doing it, and maybe I'm being a cynic, but this is clearly propagandistic. In other words, if I'm a king, I'm doing this, and of course, if everyone knows that I'm connected to a goddess, then that the goddess has come in and done this, then of course I'm more important. And furthermore, you probably you're going to think twice about usurping my authority because I've got this, divine human authority to me. And so So to connect this to the Nephilim, who are sort of matter-of-factly described as the actual physical union, the purpose is completely different. The Nephilim are products of that sexual union, which the biblical writer clearly is writing in general narrative and believes it. In other words, it's a naive belief, like, yes, this is what's going on here. The ritual, the sacred marriage ritual, is imitating it, in the sense that the king now has some sort of divine authority, kind of like divine right of kings in the Middle Ages, I suppose, in one respect. And by the way, if I'm a king and I'm divine, it doesn't have as much meaning as you think. Here we are, even if you weren't a believer, since you're living in the 21st century, you probably think in a monotheistic way. In other words, if you say, I'm an atheist, what does that mean? I'm still using my statements in the framework of monotheism. I'm saying I don't believe in that system. If atheism in other traditions, maybe even in Hinduism, wouldn't be nearly as relevant a statement as it is for here in our context. And so when I think of God, I think of it in a monotheistic way. Maybe if I put it theologically in a nutshell, the universe is divided up into two things: God and everything else that is not God. Okay, because we see a very sharp, dramatic demarcation between God and everything else. Unfortunately, in the Bible, the problem is the word for God and the word for gods is the same word, Elohim, and it looks as if the etymology of the word probably has something to do with high ones or heavenly beings. In other words, beings from other places. And it doesn't tell me anything about the nature of the being. And so, in fact, really, if you think about it, God is wholly different than all the others, even though he has the same title as they do, God. He's wholly other and apart. But in Mesopotamia and other areas, there was a gradation of divine power. In other words, you have the high gods, lesser gods, slave gods, demonic demons and angels, and then humans would be really at the bottom of the totem pole. They've also got some divine stuff, but they've got so little of it compared to everybody else that they're minuscule. And so if a king calls himself divine, it's not as shocking as it would be. And so when a Roman calls himself divine, that's divine status. What does Vespasian say in Suetonius at the end, when he's dying? Alas, I'm becoming a god. Like, now it's, he understands that I guess I was just human, after all. And so when now Egypt is probably another sort of a different world, because they talk about the incarnation, etc. And by the way, all these things don't anticipate the Christian incarnation. That's something that's wholly different and strange, and it's only described in the context of Israelite monotheism, which is turning everything upside down on its head. And so it's not, the Israelites aren't imitating anything; they're part of that world. So when you talk about the sacred marriage rituals, they're acting out on earth what the expectation of what's going on in heaven. But of course, like I said, as a cynic, I think they're doing it for their own purposes, to gain, consistency with their populace. Like I said, if you think I'm a divine right of, I have divine stuff and I'm the king, it's going to be harder. The only way to overthrow me is if I stop doing what all the other kings had been doing throughout time. And furthermore, so for example, Ur-Nama, a king of Ur, he said, Nana chose me to be king among everyone else. And how I know that he chose him? Because he's king. In other words, I became king, then in other words, history defines what's true. If I became king, it was what was supposed to happen. And so, I look at these sacred marriage rituals, and I'm not willing to go any further. And I think that even someone like Frankfurt would say the same things. He's simply being descriptive here. He's describing all of these sacred acts and what's going on, and what it's doing, of course, is, like I said, imitating the heavenly realm, which is what happens everywhere. And even that's a biblical concept too, if you think about it. The tabernacle is representing, God's holy place, and everything that's happening here is a pale representation of the heavenly realm, and I think we see that finally in the book of Revelation. So that's a cultural pattern that everyone has, and so they're doing their same thing here. But I think you've got about 10 more strains before I want to connect that to the nephilim. That's my take on it.
Okay, thank you. Two more things, and then we'll come to the concluding parts. Because we mentioned Dr. Heiser, whom both of you and I loved, and he influenced us. I want to read portions from chapter 33 when it comes to the Bulls of Bashan. Unfortunately, I don't have time, but I will tell to the audience who like taking notes again to write down Matthew 27 as well as Psalm 22. I'll just read a few of the similarities, but I don't have time to read in entirety the portions from Psalm 22 and from Matthew 27. Sure. But I'll read a few similarities. Matthew 27 verse 35 says, "They divided his clothes among themselves by casting lots." Psalm 22 verse 18 says, "They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." Matthew 27 verses 39-41. "Those who passed by reviled him, shaking their heads. In the same way, also the chief priests, along with the scribes and elders, were mocking him." Psalm 22 verses 7 and 17 say, All who see me mock me. They open wide their lips. They shake their head. They gaze. They look upon me." Lastly, Matthew 27 verse 46. Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani." That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? In Psalm 22 verse 1 says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now let's read Dr. Heiser's explanation. It's a beautiful book, lengthy paragraph, so I'll just read some. He says, "Strong Bulls of Bashan, ? We know by now that Bashan carries a lot of theological baggage. It was Old Testament version of the gates of hell, the gateway to the underworld realm of the dead. This is page 289 in Dr. Heiser's book. It was known as the place of the serpent outside the Bible, page 290. It's associated with Mount Hermon, the place where the Jews believed the rebellious sons of God from Genesis 6:1-4 descended. Simply put, if you wanted to conjure up images of the demonic and death, you would refer to Bashan. If it's true that elements of Psalm 22 prefigure the crucifixion, it makes sense that a reference to Bashan would be part of that. But we still need a bit more context for understanding it. In the early discussion of Bashan, I briefly noted the presence of the cult site at Dan, located within its northern region. The site was infamous with respect to the idolatrous worship of Samaria, the renegade northern kingdom of the 10 tribes of Israel who forsook David's dynasty after Solomon died. This confederacy and rival kingdom was set up by Jeroboam. So the worship of their gods behind Yahweh, who were called demons, Shedim, was part of identity of Bashan. Then he quotes Amos 4. We'll skip this, but now Heiser goes further. He says, since the cows or bulls of Bashan are said to speak to their husbands, scholars are universally agreed that Amos is specifically addressing upper-class women of northern Israel who were idolaters of the golden cows of Bashan. I wouldn't disagree with that necessarily, but there's more to the wording than that. Amos would be targeting temple priestesses who serve the gods among male priests. It is also quite possible that the cows of Bashan are the deities themselves in the forms of the idols. The possibility is strengthened by noticing their crimes, oppressing the poor and crushing the needy. Those same two words are used in Psalm 82, where the corrupt Elohim are accused of exactly the same crimes. For our purposes, what we know for sure that about Bashan is that it had secure associations with demonic powers. Although Psalm 22 wasn't originally messianic in focus, page 291, Matthew's use of it fixes that association. The implication is that Jesus, at the moment of agony and death, was surrounded by the Bulls of Bashan, demonic Elohim, small e, who had been the foes of Yahweh and his children for millennia. I'll read a little bit more. Bashan was the ground zero for Old Testament demonic geography, but for all the darkness conjuring up by the term, references to Bashan in the Old Testament aren't all sinister. Psalm 68, 15 to 22 describes a time when Yahweh takes ownership of Bashan. I won't read that. The first thing that sticks out of this passage is that in famous Mount Bashan is called the Mountain of God. The phrase Mountain of God is actually Mountain of Elohim in Hebrew. That means it can be translated as either Mountain of God or Mountain of the Gods.
Yeah.
The latter makes more sense than the former in context for the very observable reason that the two mountains of the passage, Bashan and Sinai, are rivals at the beginning of the psalm. The mountains of the gods, Bashan, looks with hatred at Yahweh's mountain, Mount Sinai. God desired Sinai for his abode, as the psalmist asks Bashan, why the envy? This would make little sense if Bashan was already under Yahweh's authority. And so on and so on. Why am I going to the Bulls of Bashan? Because they're in this region where the king Og was living and dwelling. So this was this region where the Bulls of Bashan are actually not literal animals, but actually taken to be understood small g gods or demons. And if we can associate them with that whole region, which was known as the land of the serpent, where King Og dwelt, who was one of the Rephaim. And Rephaim, yes, they were the giant clans, but in the underworld, in the Sheol, there was also Rephaim, which would be the spirits of these evil beings. So in the underworld, there will be, I think, even more evil, and they'll still keep in their underworld some of their power and authority. So now Jesus comes at least 1,000 years later after this time. In Matthew 27, what was written in Psalm 22 is being prophesied, what was prophesied is being fulfilled. Jesus is in the spiritual realm, being surrounded by these demons or small g gods of Bashan, where the king Og dwelt. What is your, and I know you have the book because I saw you also holding it. What is, how we can connect it with King Og and with Rephaim, because Rephaim were, yes, the giant clans, but also even worse were the Rephaim of the underground, of the underworld. When they passed, their spirits would be demonic spirits. So these are the spirits that would try to attack Jesus when he was dying. So any comment on this, because this is related with King Og? And
maybe they are. Now the term Rephaim, you said this, you're right, spirits of the underworld in some context, the giants in other contexts. Are they the same just because they're the same word? I don't know whether that connection is tenable or not. I have not looked into that, and so that's going to be something that I can work on too. If it is, then you could pull this all together. I really appreciate what Mike is doing here, because what I've tried to do with the Old Testament in many respects, he does with the New Testament, trying to understand and using all the literature at the disposal of the New Testament writer to make these connections that we can't normally make because we're so far removed from it. So when I've gone through his book, I'm thinking, all right, that's an interesting connection. I'll need to work on that sometime. Then I look at the next one. That's an interesting connection. And if I don't stop what I'm doing, it would actually take a very, very long time to look through each connection. And I'm working through it, and that's potentially one to look at. So I can't say a whole lot more about it yet, but like I said, the term Rephaim could be almost like the term American, in the sense that you and I, since we're living in the same time period, we're usually going to be on the same radar if we use the word American. But if if somebody in a couple thousand years finds out, well, wait a minute, the term American actually is some Italian guy's first name that is attached to a continent, then it's a people group. Wait a minute, but the people group never used it for themselves, Native Americans. And, in other words, we've got this term, and what they might naively do is that every time they find the term, they assume it means the same item. So, and I think that might be going on with the Rephaim. Obviously, the term means the healers. Well, the ones in the underworld aren't healers, and so, and why are they called healers when they're giants? And does that mean that the two are connected? Maybe yes, maybe no. But when in scholarship, you can muse about that, but you don't dare write an article saying they're connected unless you've shown that they're connected. That you actually fuse them together, and otherwise somebody's going to bash you, and maybe even silence your work by saying, look at what they did, those silly connections. So for me, the jury's out, and usually when Mike makes connections is because he's spent an enormous amount of time looking at the secondary literature. I can't tell you how much time it would take to, it's not so much write the book, it was to prepare a book like this, the time it took for him to master all of the secondary sources and then master the primary sources to put them together. And most of what he says about Mesopotamia, Mesopotamian scholars saying, well, yeah, we know that stuff, but we didn't really care whether it was connected to the Bible or not. And so, yeah, we know that, about the Anunnaki and all these other things and this, that, and that, we know about that stuff, but since we're not biblical scholars, we didn't know how to connect. We didn't know or even care about connecting it. And so that's the problem. So he's taken a lot of flack for trying to make those connections, and he's taken much more flack from the traditional Christian world. And I think it's probably because it's alarming and intimidating, and he's simply trying to, read the text in its original environment. And I think that he did a marvelous job. Is he right in everything? Well, no, he's human.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Dr. Chavalas, last question, because my friend Troy, who's recommended this topic when I emailed you about a month or two ago, and you picked this topic for today, I know that he was also wondering about anything about the Anunnaki from your understanding and your perspective, because at the beginning of the show, you said you're not the biblical scholar per se, you're a Mesopotamian scholar that is a Christian. Yeah. So in your understanding of Anunnaki from the Mesopotamian studies, who they were, what was their role, and if we can maybe give anything at least remotely that resembles them in the Bible, if there's something even of that sort that can be parallel.
It's a big zero. Sorry, big zero. The Anunnaki are mentioned. In fact, I even got my paper here in another volume, so I'm just going to summarize it. The Anunnaki are mentioned in maybe about 200 Mesopotamian sources. That's not very many, by the way, when you think of a couple 100,000 texts. The term probably means something like the seed of a prince. The fact that the Anunnaki have gotten wildly big in alien studies and others is probably because of a guy that I had never heard of until about 10 years ago, this Zechariah Sitchin. I had a kid come into my office one day and he says, I'm from another school and I heard you that you teach Sumerian. I said, well, I taught a handful of students. He says, well, I've been learning Sumerian from the Sumerologist. And he named the guy's name. I said, I've never heard of him. And I said, Sumerian studies is really, really small. And so if there's somebody I don't know, they must be brand new from a school that there's so few of them, even compared to Akkadian scholars. And so he said the guy's name, and so I looked him up. I said, I said, he wasn't a Sumerologist. He says, yeah, he said he was. I said, no, he didn't study with anybody And then I started studying about this guy, and I found out, oh, he's the guy who made all these connections. And I don't know how to explain this. He must have studied cuneiform language, cuneiform script on his own, and and for Sumerian, you just can't do that, because Sumerian is a language, and you've got the same. You've got 16 signs for the consonant vowel ug. They all have different meanings. You can't combine them. They're all separate. And he started combining things and making connections with things that you would only do if you were working on your own and had nobody to guide you. The problem is he did this before the internet. And so he wrote all these books before people could look at this stuff and critically evaluate. Oh my goodness. He started talking about the planet Nibiru. The word Nibiru is mentioned in the Mesopotamian sources, but it's actually the vernal equinox. It's not a planet. It's anything that crosses in there becomes Nibiru. Okay, it's not a planet. The Anunnaki were most of the time they're divine. Sometimes they're humans. In administrative texts, they're humans, because the term, it's kind of like the term itself doesn't explain their divine nature. It means seed. It means the seed of a prince. The seed of a prince could be human. Most of the time, they're talking about divine beings.
But they also mean the deity An or Anu made them. Correct?
No, not at all. That's absolutely.
That was false.
That's incorrect. That's a complete misnomer. That's what Sitchin did. Sorry to shake my head so hard.
No, I haven't read Sitchin. This was what I was reading in some documents. I thought that was legit. Okay, thanks for
Nun. The Nun is the word for prince, and in the lexical text, you can look at the materials for the Sumerian lexicon. I might even have the page that Landsberger wrote, and this is how we actually were able to learn Sumerian, is by, you would have the Sumerian word, and then you have the Akkadian syllabic statement next to it, so you would know, all right, this Sumerian sign Nun means Rubu'um or whatever, prince, and the first one has something to do with Rehum, which means the seed. I'm thinking off the top of my head here, so I got something wrong, I'm sure, but the point is that we actually have a lexical statement telling us what Annuna means. It has nothing to do with Anum. But you could, if you put it together that way, it's because you don't understand the cuneiform script or Sumerian. And so that's what Sitchin did, and it's been infecting everything else. And so whoever the Anunnaki are, it's very slippery. They are, Marduk assigns them in the Enuma Elish, 300 of them for work, 300 for the heavens, and 300 go down to the netherworld. Later on, in later periods, the Anunnaki are gods of the dead. They're never prayed to. There's never a cult of Anunnaki that they pray to. They're not mentioned in any other periods outside of Mesopotamia anywhere. You're not going to find them named or anything else. The Greeks don't know anything about them. The Bible knows nothing about them. They're often mentioned in curse formulas, but usually because they're bad, like the Apkallu. And so like the Apkallu, you'll mention the Anunnaki because you want them to stay away. It's apotropaic, get them out of here, the Anunnaki. And they're kind of like demons in Greek lore. Sometimes demons are good, sometimes demons are bad. The Anunnaki, some of them are good, some of them are bad.
Dr. Chavalas, so does it mean that in a way, not perfectly, maybe Anunnaki could be compared with the Rephaim, not the giants, but the spirits of the underworld? They are evil. You don't want to deal with.
Yes, yeah. If that's all you say, I'd say, yeah, go ahead. but I wouldn't put any one-to-one correspondence to them. And if you do, it's probably because you want to call attention to yourself. And so I wouldn't go any further with that. Sometimes they're called the Agigi, which are the top 7. Sometimes they're not. And you have to realize, you think about it, if I took all the literature from the Library of Congress to show you what American culture is like, you'd find a lot of stuff that's contradictory because people have different opinions. And guess what? Mesopotamia is the same way. You got 3,000 years of history. And when I look at a text, I have to say, wait a minute, where's this text from? What period is it from? Is it a copy from an earlier text? Because, even like our New Year's rituals, most of them are from late period Uruk. There are probably copies of earlier ones, but we don't know whether how they copied them, and that whole manuscript tradition. And it might even help us understand how the biblical text was worked through too. But Gilgamesh is called the judge of the Anunnaki because he's in the underworld. So it makes sense that he would, but that's also broken context. And as usual, the Anunnaki, like the Apkallu, are never the main topic of any text that we have. So dead end.
So still fun to research and read about, but okay.
Yeah. But you gotta hire a Mesopotamian to look at that stuff because they're only there. And I don't know anything about Sitchin. I don't know whether he was trying to whether he was just a fraud. He was a fraud intellectually. Whether he was trying to pull the wool over people's eyes, I don't know. But danger.
Dr. Chavalas, before we log out for today, is there anything that maybe we missed from the outline, or that is on your heart that maybe you want to make another parallel or do the concluding part? You can do it now.
Well, I really appreciate being on. This has been a lot of fun. I always enjoy talking about stuff like this, and I guess I can say first, I'd love to have contact with people. They can either contact me through email that you have, or they can, my own podcast. I'm doing more directed things right now. I've worked through just first three chapters of Genesis, but I like Mike did with much of the New Testament. I've been trying to do with the Old Testament, trying to understand it in its original context. It's not mutually exclusive with our modern understanding of theology. It's simply a way to try to understand what did this passage mean to an Israelite in the Iron Age, and if it meant that then, what does that mean for me today? And so this is hopefully not merely an intellectual exercise, but something that will inform me and help. I don't know, to me, studying it this way is kind of like when I was a kid. I had we had TVs. They were black and white and they were little, and I thoroughly enjoyed watching my baseball games on it. But now here I am 60 some years later, if I'm watching a baseball game and say, hey, let's go watch it on a 1960, TV, I'm saying, no, I would never want to go back because it's such high and clear definition. There's even color now. There wasn't color when I was a kid. So the point is that it informs it in a way that changes my understanding. It crystallizes my understanding better. It hasn't really changed my theology. In many respects, my theology probably hasn't changed a whole lot since I was 4 years old. I mean, like Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Everything else since then is pretty much a footnote, if you think about it, but I've got a lot of footnotes. And so I still espouse to that one, but I'm learning more and more and more. And so that's what I do. And my goal is to try to bring it to an interested public in a way that is not alarming to them and doesn't cause them to, be offended or run away by it. So that's sort of the onus is on me there, because Mesopotamian scholars traditionally have not been good at presenting ourselves to the public. And so And in many respects, just to finish with my Mike Heiser fest here, is that though he's a younger guy than me, he was a tremendous example of how to do this in a way that was that scholarly, humble, and not calling attention to himself, even though, of course, that couldn't be helped, but it wasn't because of him. And so his model is excellent.
Dr. Chavalas, Amber, the same lady who said she's a fan of your books and who's studying Hebrew in her seminary, asked me like about an hour ago when you were talking about that 600 page book, you were talking about some newsletters, and she wants to check that. What is it, newsletters, if you remember that you mentioned an hour?
It's the fellow who runs it. His name is Jack Sasson, who was another one of these great Mesopotamian / biblical scholars. He is. The newsletter is called Agade, Agade. So all you have to do is Google Jack Sasson Agade, and you'll find it. And you can contact him and sign up for it, and you'll have a feast of news, ancient Near Eastern news information. It's truly for geeks.
Yeah. Well, she's a geek, so I wanted to. She was like, please ask Dr. Chavalas again. Yeah. So I did. I hope she's watching this. Dr. Chavalas, thank you for this couple of hours. Thank you for sharing your Mesopotamian knowledge with us and trying to somehow parallel or cross-reference the Bible. Sometimes it would agree, sometimes it will disagree. And of course, there will be layers of agreement and disagreement. So I hope for the audience, they took notes. I just want to say that with approval, Dr. Chavalas, I wrote the outline by quoting so many different sources of 4,000 letters. We didn't even mention half of those things. Yes. That would be at least another episode or two. So we couldn't mention so many things that we thought we would, because the time flies, especially with the questions, especially when you mention something, oh, but what about this? Or should I mention this? And I know this is the same time when you sit down with your friends, time always goes faster than you think. Yeah. So yeah, we couldn't mention a bunch of other sources, quotations. I prepared, like I said, almost very close to 4,000 letters for tonight, but we couldn't mention these. But thankfully, in the episode description of this video, below Dr. Chavalas's Amazon link for his books, I have mentioned the most important, almost 10 sources that I piled up. So you can go, guys, and get those books or get those PDFs if they're articles. Most of them are available through JSTOR. I think the only thing you need would be a library account or some access. I got them all through my friend Amber, who again is a seminary, so she got all these articles for free for me. I thank you, Amber, for helping me being prepared for tonight. Yeah. Dr. Chavalas, thank you once again. Maybe we'll do something again in the future on some other topic. It's been a pleasure. May God bless you. And yeah, I would also invite everyone to keep subscribing, liking. This helps a lot. Everything we do is absolutely free. This is not just a nerdy podcast. It's a ministry where we're trying to compare so many different things and point people to God. Everything we do is free. Any donation or any click, any subscription will help the YouTube and the algorithm so we can make even more. Thank you all. God bless you, Dr. Chavalas. Thank you all for your kind comments in the chat. Thank you all watching now. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
God bless. Thank you so much.